I'm a little bit pressed for time, which, given the typical vapidity of my presentation, will not be a problem. There's a slight marriage vibe here. As I was sitting there, I was thinking that if it was actually marriage, it would have to be in Utah, given the multiple women and one man. So I shall move on. Firstly, my title is from a song from the early 80s by Orange Juice. If there's one key takeaway you get from my presentation, it's the chord sequence for that song, for the musical among you. And I see my boss is here, and he cannot deny that I've given something substantial back to the community. Things have changed. This is a fantastic quote from a literature review we had done by a colleague, Catherine Walsh. Some years ago when we were looking at collection development policies. The basic elements of any library are books, people, and buildings in precisely that order of importance. Some of you out there may still think that is the case. I would not publicly suggest it because we tend to say with some legitimacy that people are now the most important thing, our communities. The collections and the buildings are there to serve the communities. So that's from 1979. Things have changed. Other things as regards this whole idea of collection development policies are still constant. A quote there from 2006, development policy can bring order out of chaos, quite right too. And libraries without collection development policies are like businesses without business plans, which I think is probably a bit more open to debate, and I will just touch on it in my very last slide, or one of my last slides. They may or may not be necessary. Certainly, I think we would say we found ours necessary. I should say as well two things. Because I'm a complete buffoon, I forgot to actually include a link to the collection development policy. It is on our website. If you Google it, I checked earlier on because I was worried about whether we'd said anything about preservation after Jim's talk. We have. You will find it. Also, I'm not actually going to talk too much about the process of developing the policy because really don't have too much time. If anyone is interested in such things, you're a sucker for punishment and find me later. So, a lot of these influencers that we deal with, the nature of our collections, some of them have grown, some of them have constricted. That RCSI is a very good example of changes. The scope of them have changed, electronic, digital, born digital. The value of them, and value it's a very loaded term. The monetary value may, as was illustrated there, be less than you imagine. But the value to research develops over time as well. What becomes important as research trends and interdisciplinarity continue, that really has a big influence on the research collections and the collections in your library which are being used. And that impacts on their relevance. And consequently, it impacts on their use. Something that was heavily circulated or heavily interrogated a number of years ago may, for very valid reasons, have diminishing use at the moment. And that poses the perennial question of, for academic libraries at least, do we get rid of it? And the rarity, today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chips wrapper, unless it's digital. Rarity is a thing that obviously evolves and changes and can be impacted by a variety of things. Disaster in one library leading to something all of a sudden having a preeminent rarity that was previously unforeseen. Just to talk a bit more about the multiplicity of this again, there are collections that we use for teaching and learning, high circulation, they may be superseded. There's a whole different type, research, local interest, which something for North Kildare and Maynooth may be really important to us, to Galway or to College of Surgeons it may not be. And then the canonical works, the having of which confer a lot of status on a library. They have a premium status. So there's hugely different aspects to collections, as we know, and there are equally a commensurate amount of different demands on our collections. And grappling with all these is where the policy comes in. This was our last policy. It is from 2001, and it is vastly different. If you were to look at it now in terms of the formats, the selection methodologies, the acquisitions models which we use, which Monica alluded to in some of her talk, and usage patterns, and even our ability to actually understand usage patterns in the modern collection. So, there is potential there with a policy. And it's Peggy Johnson in 2014 talking about this, a plan for how it will be developed, parameters guiding that development. It's a systematic document, it's comprehensive, but it's also got to be detailed, and it's got multiple purposes. And a critical point there, public planning, allocation. Collection development policy can be really useful for that. So in a way, it's got to be all things to all people, and it's got to serve an awful lot of different drivers and an awful lot of different masters, and that's no easy thing. So in terms of drivers for ours, we know print isn't going away. Thank God print isn't going away. But we also know that, for example, in our building, which is a good few years old now, the use of the building is very focused on student needs, student spaces. So the ability to sort of pack a building with shelves of books is increasingly a thing that's under debate, at the very least. Critically important, as with almost any policy document, a desire to articulate our intentions, and critically, the value of what we're trying to do. We believe this stuff is important. We want our paymasters, our managers, our senior executives, whoever they are, to understand why this is important. And that's a policy's job. Provide a context. This is why this is important. This is what our collections are about. Provide clarity, and I've just a little Captain America shield in there. A, because he's awesome, and B, because that's where the policy comes into its own, as a shield. You're providing clarity. We don't take this, and this is why. But also, we are a professional body, so let's try and ascribe these professional values into a policy. There are risks. If you get it if you're a little bit overzealous, it can be a bit too restrictive, and it will prevent you doing things. The example we always use in Maynooth is, if hypothetically our English department aren't really focusing on Joyce, and then somebody comes into us with a first edition of Ulysses, do we say, well, sorry, it doesn't really meet the teaching and research needs of the university, or do we bite their hand off? It is the latter. You don't want your policy contravening that opportunity. It can be a bit difficult to understand the difference between collection development and collection management. One is sort of ongoing, one is more of an aspirational and aspirational thing. And then we get into the issue of collections versus content. And that, I certainly don't have the answer to that, but it is something that we had to grapple with at the outset. The reality is, do the students care what we're describing as content, or what we consider to be content, versus what we consider to be collections? I don't think they do, so it probably doesn't matter, but it is a thing that needs to be considered. I won't spend too long on this. Our policy is modular. The critical thing about that is that any part of it can be updated as needed. So let's say, hypothetically, massive changes in digital in the next few years, or e-resources as a result of procurement, for example. We can change that bit without it having a knock-on to the rest of the policy. So that is a great thing from an administrative point of view, in terms of understanding that different parts of collections evolve at different rates. That's critical. So for that reason, it's led by the different collection types: special collections and archives, general collections, printed, open print collections, electronic collections, digital collections. It does work as a shield. So for example, the way we always think about it is the person on the desk that has somebody come in and say, I have this stuff. They know on a Saturday what they need to do, and they know that they can say, well, look, firstly, you need to refer to this or this. They're not caught on the hop. That's really important for staff who aren't normally maybe doing this work or considering these things. They don't want to be exposed to the idea that they may say no to something on the desk that turns out to be really valuable. It is a high-level document. It's a policy document. It's not prescriptive. It's not regulation. So again, we will not turn away any Ulysses first editions for any of you out there that are considering to donate. And it's honest. So it isn't a PR spin. It is trying to be honest about our collections and what we're going to do with them. But equally, it is aspirational. It is trying to say, this is where we're reaching for. We're reaching for the stars. I'm going to talk very briefly about the impact. How am I doing for time? Yeah, very briefly. I just want to talk about a couple of different things. The policy is linked to impact, so I'm not suggesting that the policy is the key driver for everything I'm going to talk about, but it underpins them in different ways. So it has been linked to some very significant staffing changes we've made in Maynooth, and equally, I'm going to show a few examples of changes we've made to collection development, which again refer back to the policy. So, it did galvanize staff, much like what Monica was talking about there. We involved every single member of staff in this. We surveyed them, we asked them for their understanding of the collection. We found some fantastic information out that if we hadn't done it that way, we never would have learned about our own collection. And this goes from the people who buy the material, the people who shelve the material, the people who are on the desk who are hearing about requests. We learned a huge amount in a very holistic way. It has inspired subsequent, what you might call more operational changes. So for example, the idea from the policy was that it would lead and spin off into other changes. So we revised our donations policy on the foot of it. We've revised acquisitions models on the foot of it. There's always, I suppose, a question about whether we've done enough, or equally whether you want the tail wagging the dog. So for example, you don't want to change something just because it's suggested by the policy when it's not actually going to work in the library. Key impact, which affects me typically more than anyone, is to try, despite the fact that it's not prescriptive, stick to the plan. Because somebody comes along and says, we have an archive that relates to, let's say hypothetically, medicine, which Maynooth doesn't have an expertise in, and I look and go, oh, fantastic, in precisely that tone. And all of a sudden I'll go, well, that would just be brilliant, and here's what we could do, and so on and so forth. And one of my colleagues, quite rightly, will say, what about the policy that you drew up? And then I'll begrudgingly concede the point. But that is really, really important in a time of limited resources. When you can take in, and we all take in collections, you don't want to be saying, well, obviously we won't get to that for 5 years, but thank you very much for thinking of us. So you do need to try and focus on your strengths. So corollary of that is, for me, and I stress it is only me, they're all very good, stick to the plan, Hugh. In terms of staff, I just want to show this here. We used to have cataloguers and subject librarians and so on. One of the things we've done, and we're not the first to do this, and I suspect we won't be the last, is we try to make certain roles a bit more blended. So we have colleagues now who work in resource description and collection development. That to me highlights the importance of collection development and the prominence that we're giving it. It also highlights something that personally for me, at 20 years doing this, has been a bugbear, where you'd have catalogers who knew huge amounts about gaps in the collection and strategic areas where we need to grow and areas where things have been superseded, but may not necessarily have had the forum to express that. So now our colleagues who are doing all this descriptive work and metadata work are also involved in things like gap analysis. They're hugely involved in things like structured deselection, and they're looking at usage analytics in conjunction with other colleagues. So we're trying to harness the best of all possible worlds. That's the curatorial aspect. My colleague Helen Farrell is speaking, I think, tomorrow, and she works in my other colleague Lorna's team. She's our academic engagement librarian, but she now is heavily involved in feeding back to those of us who work in the more curatorial and collections aspect. So for example, in things like trials for e-resources, we're getting one message out, whereas historically, if you had a multiplicity of subject librarians, the message might be, for very legitimate reasons, changed. If we're talking about gaps, again, the message coming into us and the message coming out is relatively harmonious. And that's really, really helpful. And what that means then is everyone involved in the collection management cycle and the collection development cycle are talking to each other, and it's a full circle. A couple of things as well, and I think it's mentioned in another colleague's poster. We're very proud of our UDCs, our special collections and archives. One of the things that is really important, and it was alluded to by several people earlier on, is trying to show the importance of these things. So we know they're important, but if they're not being used and engaged with, they're a little bit more inert than we'd like. So a couple of examples here that were done towards the back end of last year and early this year. The first one is based on an archive called the Little Hales Archive. And what was done with it was we had transcriptions. We'd been doing a bit of this ourselves. They were imaged. The transcriptions were embedded. There's a variety of different primary sources used. The students did this. They're all postgraduate students in our Digital Humanities Institute. And from our perspective, it ticks a number of boxes. One of the things we talk about in a collection development policy is making this stuff accessible. Having it digital obviously helps with that. But one of the other things we talk about is having this wonderful material interacted with by the student body and the academic community. And that is not always easy to do. If it was easy to do, everyone would be doing it. But this is a classic case in point. So that's with an archive. The other one, which was done by the same students under the same overarching module and project, is the 3D cuneiform project, where they 3D imaged some of the cuneiforms that are in the Russell Library, which date back to the 5th century. And they did all sorts of funky, cool things that I'm not remotely qualified to speak about. But again, I would urge you to go and look at them. And again, something that on the face of it is an inert cuneiform tablet is now students and everyone around the world can interact with it in a totally different way. So we're trying to harness the good stuff that we have. It's not always possible, but it can be done. On a more, I suppose, a more sustainable and ongoing perspective, the collection development policy outlines some of the models we use at a principle level, but it also points out that we will endeavour to develop them and evolve them. So we did a very successful project this year, which again, I suspect there is a poster or a talk or something. There's a Liskia down there. Yep, there's a poster at the back. Can I direct your attention to a Liskia's poster? There you go. On evidence-based acquisitions. We did it with Cambridge. And that's precisely the sort of thing, the outcome we want from when we started at the policy level. Similarly, in the next semester, we're going to be looking at e-textbooks with another company. So it's all about new models. This, to me, is the key question. Could we have done this anyway? Or would we have done it anyway? There is no specific answer. But what we can say, I think, with a degree of certainty, and I did solicit some opinion on this before I came down here, is having the policy had a galvanic aspect to it, where it stimulated us to think about all these things in a way that day-to-day, run-of-the-mill, you'd like to, but you don't get the opportunity to. So my gut feeling is we could have done it, but there's no guarantee it would have happened, if that makes sense. I have some references here. I had a wonderful idea about scheduling a load of tweets with a load of other references, which I'd ping out as I was speaking and look sort of omnipotent. I haven't done that, mortal coil. But I have plenty more if you're interested. As I said at the outset, we had a colleague, Kat Walsh, who did a great literature review at the outset of this project and really helped tee it up for us to understand the transformative potential of it. It has collections. It has transformed how we interact with the collections. And most importantly, it gives us nearly a foundational document to go back to. I have plenty more time. I have nothing really else to say, and lunch is on the way, so I will simply finish there. Thank you.
Okay, as Hugh says, it is lunchtime, but I would like to thank our panel of speakers. I think we've heard 3 excellent presentations, and there's lots of questions I would like to ask. It would be unfair to restrict it to one question. We should have a question for each presentation. But could I ask our speakers, will you speak to people throughout the conference, maybe who have questions? And I really, as I said, enjoyed the presentations, from all the advice we got from Monica about devolving to the functional heads who had responsibility for various aspects of the project. And again, I noticed Hugh picked up on the theme of involving staff in the whole process for the collection development policy in Maynooth. And to Kate and Mary for giving us the courage to know that we can do what you did. I mean, because we would have been so scared to even contemplate that. But I think you went about it in an excellent way, you know, and you can't argue with what you presented to management and whatever. So 3 excellent presentations, very enjoyable. Thank you so much to all of you. And can I just say one last thing, that in October, CONUL Collections and CONUL Training and Development have a joint seminar on collection management, where some of these themes will be followed up on, and that you'll have another opportunity to engage with some of our speakers. So thank you.